Welcome back to Before 1900s Horror. I am your host, and today, we are stepping into the frozen darkness of 17th century Bavaria. In the heart of the Alps, when the sun disappears behind the jagged peaks, a primitive ritual begins. This is not a legend told for entertainment. This was a nightmare people lived and died for. Tonight, we uncover the disturbing truth behind the Perchten masks. Why were they carved from wood and bone? And who, or what, was the 13th member that no one dared to count? Prepare yourself. Once the mask goes on, the human disappears. Let's dive into the dark origins of history's most feared tradition. A winter night in 1672. A small village at the foot of the Bavarian Alps is covered in snow. The sound of carving comes from inside a wooden house on the edge of the village. A carpenter is carving a monstrous face from the trunk of an old pine tree. These masks are no ordinary decoration. They are Perchten, in Bavarian folklore, a being whose form is beyond human imagination. Historical records show that people would no longer be human if they wore these masks. Their inner being would be transformed into a shadow of a primordial darkness. In today's documentary, we will see why 17th century villagers considered these masks more of a curse than art. This time of December was called Rauhnacht, or the 12 Cursed Nights, when the walls between the worlds of the living and the dead become thin. The village is so silent that even the sound of one's own breathing can be heard. This silence was the main source of fear. Looking down from the top of the mountain, it seemed that someone was staring at the village from the darkness. The villagers believed that going outside at this time meant encountering an evil force, so they gathered around the fire. But still, a group of men in the village had to wear this mask. In the name of driving away the cold, they invited an unknown horror. These Perchten masks were made of heavy wood and wild animal horns. Some masks weighed more than 15 kilograms. Real animal skin and sometimes human hair were placed inside the mask. When the carver made the eyes, it seemed that the mask was coming to life. Once the mask was on, it was almost impossible to see the outside world. All that could be smelled was old wood and dried leather. A craftsman's diary from 1640 recorded that when he cut some wood, red streaks would come out, looking like blood. Not out of technical ingenuity, but out of a strange fear, the craftsman would distort the face of the mask in such a way that it would always scream. When a villager wore this mask, his familiar identity would gradually disappear. He would become a sheep-parket or ugly monster. The man behind the mask would no longer speak. He would only breathe deeply, mechanically, making the atmosphere around him heavy. He wore a heavy iron bell. With every step, the sound of the bell echoed like a cry in every house in the village. When his neighbors were behind the mask, he was no longer recognizable. Even his own wife could not recognize him. This anonymity gave him a strange power. Anyone could attack anyone they wanted from behind a mask, and the blame fell on the Perchten spirit. An old parish record mentions a strange incident. No one could say for sure how many people were taking part in the procession. If 12 men from the village went out wearing masks, 13 pairs of footprints would be found on the snow. Who that 13th member was is still a mystery. The extra member of the procession never spoke, only kept an eye on everyone from the end of the group. When the priest tried to stop them, the 13th member would blend into the darkness as if he had never existed. The villagers noticed that some of the members of the procession were much taller than normal, which is impossible for a human being. In the 17th century, the Catholic Church declared this practice to be devil worship and tried to ban it. But the fear was so deep that the villagers gave more importance to the old spirit of the mountain than to the instructions of the church. The local priest wrote, "During the day they kneel and pray, but at night the same people wander in the darkness in the form of monsters." This double life mentally shattered the villagers. They did not know whether their neighbors were humans or monsters. When the heavy bells could be heard in the darkness, it seemed that the entire village was going through a collective nightmare. After the festival was over, the masks were put back in the old warehouse. But the atmosphere in the village was no longer the same. The villagers noticed that after the festival, the nature of many men had changed forever. They had become reclusive and violent. Those old masks are still preserved in some museums in Bavaria. It is said that at night, if you look into their eye sockets, you can see a strange glow. Even after the 12 nights of winter were over, the fear would linger until the following spring. People believed that once the mask was worn, its imprint would remain on the soul for life. Today we might call it a mere folktale, but in that 17th century snow-covered village, the Perchten was a living and visible horror. Here is the next part, from scenes 36 to 70. At this stage, we will shed light on the hallucinations, the isolation of the village, and the psychological torment inside the mask. On the nights immediately following Christmas, the weather in the Alps would turn cruel. The surroundings would be covered in white fog. The village streets would then be unrecognizable. Each house would become a deserted island. This isolation was the reign of the Perchten. When there was no one to ask for help, a shadow would stand outside each window. The villagers would stare into the flames of the fire, as if a little light could save them from this icy terror. But as soon as the flames began to flicker, it was clear that someone was turning the doorknob from outside. The sound of the iron bells tied to the feet of the Perchtens no longer felt festive. There was no rhythm to that sound. Sometimes the sound seemed to be right next to the ear. Sometimes it seemed to be coming from a great distance, pounding against the mountain. A document from 1680 mentions that some villagers temporarily lost their hearing due to the sound of this bell. They claimed that someone was whispering behind the sound of the bell, telling them about their secret sins. As the night grew deeper, the metallic sounds began to transform into the sound of human laughter. For the young man who first put on this heavy mask, the world changed forever. The views seen through the narrow slits of the mask were partial and distorted. He could only see a few feet of ground in front of him. He could hear nothing but his own heavy breathing. This loneliness took him into a strange trance. Many claimed that after wearing the mask for a few hours, they forgot what their real names were. The touch of the wood on the face no longer felt loose. It seemed to merge with the skin. The shadow of the procession, whom no one recognized, always remained behind the tallest Percht. When the others grew tired, the 13th member was still jumping with equal vigor. He was not tired at all. An eyewitness wrote that the shadow had no shoes on his feet, but no blood had frozen on the ice. The village dogs, instead of barking at the shadow, would hide their faces in fear under the ground. There was an old belief that if anyone tried to unmask the 13th member, they would see nothing but empty darkness. The Perchten did not just walk, they roamed the village streets like a kind of predator. If someone knocked on their door 3 times, the resident of that house had to stay awake all night. They believed that these knocks were actually tests. If someone opened the door out of fear, their soul would be cursed for that year. While tourists from the city thought it was a game, for the locals it was a life and death struggle. When the Perchtens caught someone, they would throw them straight into a pile of ice and sprinkle ashes on them. A large fire would be lit in the village square. The Perchtens would dance in circles around the fire. The wooden masks would come to life in the red light of the fire. The shadows would take on monstrous shapes on the walls. According to some, they would see shapes in the smoke of the fire that were impossible for humans to imagine. The craftsmen would use certain herbs to paint the masks, which would create a kind of pungent odor in the heat of the fire. That odor and the heat of the fire combined to lead the audience into a kind of mass hypnosis. The morning after the festival, those who wore the masks would often not remember anything about the previous night. They had strange bruises on their bodies and their feet were frozen blue. The village elders said that this memory loss was proof that someone else had used their bodies at night. When they looked in the mirror, their own eyes seemed a little darker and stranger. In the light of day, the masks would turn back into lifeless pieces of wood, as if the horror of the night was just a nightmare. Around 1685, special representatives of the church came to the village to investigate the Perchten custom. The villagers would hide the masks in their secret workshops, but the special smell of wood could not be hidden. The priest warned that those who took on the guise of monsters were actually leasing their souls to the devil. During the investigation, it was found that some masks were stuck to the walls of the houses as if they had become part of the wall. The young children in the village were afraid to even look at the statue of Jesus crucified in the church due to fear. The procession of the park hats often went deep into the forest, beyond the village limits. Under the snow-covered pine trees, the heavy bell sound became a strange oven. The animals of the forest would run away, senseless, as if they had recognized an ancient hunter. Experienced hunters said that the park hats changed shape in the forest. They began to walk on all fours. There were no spectators, no light. There was only the union of humans with the primordial darkness. After removing the mask, it was seen that the skin on the cheeks of many had been torn by rubbing against the roughness of the wood. But the strange thing was that instead of blood coming out of the wounds, a kind of black sticky substance came out. The muscles of the necks of those who had worn the mask for a long time became unusually stiff. They could no longer stand straight, as if their bodies had adapted to that monstrous shape. The village doctors called this condition Perchten fever, for which there was no medicine or cure. Strange things would happen in houses where the Perchten had once invaded. Heavy footsteps could be heard behind closed doors, as if someone was walking in an invisible mask. The food tasted bitter, and a kind of rotten leather smell could always be found in the corners of the rooms. The villagers believed that the Perchten left their shadows in the rooms even when they were gone. At night, scratches could be found on the window panes that did not belong to any known animal's claws. The old man who carved the mask gradually became isolated from society. He claimed that the wood told him how to cut it and which eye sockets would hold the light. Anyone who entered his room would see that he had carved thousands of tiny wooden eyes. Those eyes watched the newcomer from every corner of the room. One night, he was found buried under a huge mask he had made himself, a satisfied smile on his face. Some of the people in the procession claimed that they had marched for a few minutes, but in reality 3 days had passed. No one could tell where they had been during this lost time. Their clothes would be torn and rocks from unknown mountains would be found in their pockets. Had they gone to some parallel world, or had they become guests of the primitive spirits who lived in the mountains? These unresolved questions created a permanent fear in the minds of the villagers. When the snowfall finally stopped and the sky cleared, a strange peace would descend. But that peace was as silent as a crematorium. No one spoke to anyone. Everyone waited for the next year, because they knew that it was beyond their power to stop this tradition. Perchten was not just a festival, it was a dark part of their existence that they could not deny. In every corner of the village, in the shade of every tree, the presence of that wooden monster was present all year round. As the snow begins to melt, muddy water flows down the mountain slopes. But the water seems darker than usual. The villagers return to their usual farming activities, but the fatigue of the night lingers under their eyes. When they look at each other, they don't just see their neighbors. They see the masked man who may have knocked on their door last night. As they plow, sometimes an animal bone or a piece of a bell from last year's procession emerges from the ground. Every spring seems to usher in a new silence, where no one talks about the old night. Even in the scorching summer sun, the ice in some places does not melt, where the 13th member stood. Hunters noticed that no moss grows on those particular rocks on the mountain. Even the animals in the forest avoid that path, as if there were an invisible wall. The village elders say that when the Perchten return, they drag something from deep within the earth. The wind always makes a howling sound to fill that void. When the little village children grow up, the clay dolls they make as a plaything also look strangely like the Perchtens. Fear is in their blood. They know the details of that monstrous shape without seeing it. No boy dares to open that old wooden box kept in his father's cupboard. They know that a being sleeps inside that box, waiting for their touch. Every man in the family knows that one day he too will have to tie that heavy bell around his waist. Centuries pass. Those isolated villages in Bavaria are now crowded with tourists. That old, terrible custom has now become known as a cultural festival. Under the colorful lights and camera flashes, those wooden masks no longer seem so scary. People now buy the masks for money and arrange them in their drawing rooms. But even today, local craftsmen close the door when making a mask. When tourists return to their hotels at night, locals feel a strange unease within themselves. Even today, in the festival crowd, you can sometimes see someone whose clothes are modern but whose manners are ancient. Even today, during the countdown, you can sometimes see an extra person whom no one recognizes. Sometimes, the camera lens captures something that is impossible to see with the naked eye. Has artificial light, made by man, really been able to dispel that ancient darkness? Perhaps the real Perchten still live in those deep caves of the Alps. People only try to imitate them, but the real entity waits deep in the mountains. Whenever a big snowstorm comes, all the sounds of modern technology stop. Then the sound of the primitive bells can be heard again, not coming from an electric speaker. That sound reminds us of how fragile the civilization we have built is. The camera slowly moves towards the ruins of an abandoned 16th century church. There is a warning carved into the stone, faded by time. He who wears a mask loses his face. He who calls upon the darkness merges with it. The screen fades to black as the last sun sets on the mountaintop. All that can be heard is the sound of something heavy dragging across the snow and the soft echo of a single bell. Silence.
Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe for more horror.